Mituta, Mashikuna, Panikuna, Wokikuna. Indigenous peoples. Who are indigenous peoples? Let's first understand what the word indigenous means. Indigenous comes from the Latin word indigena, which means native, which in turn is formed by two Greek words, Indu or endo, which means within, and genus, which means birth or race. Indigenous is anything that occurs or exists naturally in a given place or region. Indigenous peoples, communities, or nations are those that have a historical continuity from pre-invasion and pre-colonial times, and that today they consider themselves distinct from the dominant groups or dominant societies in the countries where they live. Indigenous peoples have a strong linkage to the land and territories and the natural resources. They have their own traditional ways of life, their own cultural identity, which many times is different from the modern society, from mostly urbanized groups. Indigenous peoples also have their own languages. In spite of the fact that in their countries there is a dominant language, an official language, indigenous peoples therefore are many times bilingual and sometimes even trilingual because they speak languages from neighboring communities. I'm very proud to say that I belong to one of those indigenous nations. My grandfather was born in Cacha in 1896. Cacha is the cradle of the Puruá nation in the highlands of Ecuador, the Chimborazo province, and we're very proud of that. 2 generations later, we still are deeply connected to our indigenous and our community roots. I had the opportunity to serve as the first National Secretary for Indigenous Peoples Affairs in the country of Ecuador. And today, I am the Global Advisor for Indigenous Peoples at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Today, I would like to talk to you about the importance of understanding, preserving, and strengthening indigenous peoples' cultures and respecting their rights and aspirations in today's world. One important thing to know is that indigenous peoples are not intrinsically vulnerable. Quite on the contrary, indigenous peoples are extremely resilient, adaptable, and they have managed to live and thrive in their own natural environments for thousands of years. However, modern society poses many significant threats to their lands and territories, their livelihoods, their cultural patrimony, languages, and ultimately their survival. Most modern nation states today are a product of invasions, colonization, and subjugation of dominant, more aggressive groups. And therefore, the majority of governments in the world have historically tried to eliminate indigenous peoples. How have they done this? The first way is by trying to assimilate them into the dominant national society or culture. Number 2, by marginalizing them from key decision-making processes in the countries where they live. And 3, by imposing ways of life and cultural institutions which are different from their own and would ultimately destroy them. Fortunately, in recent years, the world has begun to recognize the injustice done to indigenous peoples for centuries, and the immense value of their distinct cultures, and also the historical contribution to our planet today. So, through decades of struggle, indigenous peoples have gained recognition at the highest level in the world through the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations in the year 2007. But in spite of this recognition at the UN level, the ILO, the World Bank, and other global institutions, unfortunately, indigenous peoples continue to face imminent threats to their right to self-determination, their lands and territories, and their cultural identity. There are some factors which have compounded those threats in recent years. First of all, the wonderful richness of the natural resources in the lands where indigenous peoples live are threatened by the voracity of the economic system that today is trying to exploit those resources. Second, the imposition of a model or vision of development on the part of government and dominant parts of society that consider that indigenous peoples are backward and actually are an obstacle for development. And third, the notion that a country can only make progress and achieve important economic development by having a homogeneous, integrated, monolingual, and mononational society. Let's understand these three factors. First, some numbers, some statistics so that you know what we're talking about. It is estimated that indigenous peoples are about 350 million people in the world, living in more than 70 countries and representing more than 5,000 individual groups or nations. This population is bigger than the entire United States population today. From the Inuits in the Arctic, to the San in Namibia and Africa, to the Mayas in Mesoamerica, to the Quechuas and Aymaras in the Andes, to the Maori in the Pacific Islands, indigenous peoples bring an amazing diversity, almost mind-boggling diversity to the entire world. And they only represent 6% of the world population. Indigenous peoples have an intimate collective relationship to their lands and the natural environment. 85% of the biodiversity in the world is located in indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And many of the reserves of natural gas, oil, and minerals in the world are also within indigenous peoples' lands. In the last 20 years, the world has seen what we call a land tenure devolution. That is, land that is returning to the hands of indigenous peoples and local communities. And although this seems to be like a great achievement for indigenous peoples and local communities, the downside of this is that now they find themselves fighting increasingly aggressive attempts by governments and corporations to access those resources under their lands. Studies by the World Bank and other institutions show that 15% of the poor population in the world are indigenous peoples. Also, about 33%, that is 1/3 of the people who live in poverty in the rural areas of the world are indigenous peoples. This shows that indigenous people suffer from a chronic, entrenched poverty level and alarming health, nutritional, and educational disadvantages, even in developed countries like the United States and Canada. So, as critical as poverty is, this is only one part of the monumental threats faced by indigenous peoples. As we have explained, the main threats are the land grabbing that goes on to exploit the natural resources in the lands of indigenous peoples, and the lack of recognition of self-determination and their culture. So the interesting question here is, what is or what should be the vision for development of indigenous peoples? Indigenous peoples reject the notion of development that focuses only on short-term gains and that threatens their own livelihoods, their traditional ways of life, and their collective rights to their lands. So indigenous peoples reject unsustainable and culturally inappropriate development. So this means that indigenous peoples are totally aligned with what we call today sustainable development. So it just makes sense to think that if the world system, economic system, would focus predominantly on sustainable development and on finding renewable sources of energy, then the threats to the indigenous peoples would substantially diminish, and actually indigenous peoples could become partners for sustainable development in all the countries of the world. And also, given that indigenous peoples have lived in harmony for thousands of years in mountains, in forests, in deserts, in rivers, and in oceans, they can also be the teachers and mentors of the world in what is known today as sustainable development. Let's analyze now the third critical factor, which is the notion of assimilation and homogenizing societies as indispensable for development. Well, the majority of countries in the world are not making enough efforts to embrace human diversity. But why is diversity so important? Diversity is so important because it's essential for life. Scientists have already established that the planet is an ecosystem whose productivity is dramatically increased by the diversity of organisms that live within the planet. Yet, when it comes to the human species, diversity and a full understanding of what it means seems to be still very far away. Many of the most violent and conflictive situations in the world today stem from ethnic, religious, racial, or some form of discrimination. So even though there are laws and international regulations against discrimination and laws to enforce human rights, governments and civil society seem to have a very difficult time in understanding, embracing, and promoting human diversity. So here is where indigenous peoples can play a transformational role as a legacy for all humanity. Indigenous peoples are descendants of human civilizations that had immense knowledge. They domesticated plants and animals, created magnificent architectural works, utilized botanical resources for healing, and had sophisticated philosophical, spiritual, and ethical principles. But this knowledge has been largely lost. But the good news is that indigenous peoples are still living and thriving in thousands of communities around the world. Indigenous peoples could play an important role today to bring this vast knowledge to the world. Their knowledge cuts across many, many practical aspects of human activity, from cultural heritage, cosmovision, music, and art, to the systems of reciprocity, solidarity, family values, practical knowledge in forest, agriculture, water, etc. Studies have shown that indigenous communities have strong family values. For example, among the Aboriginal people in Australia, children are not just the concern of the biological parents, but they're the concern of the entire community. The raising, care, education, and discipline of children are the responsibility of everyone, male, female, young, old. Indigenous education stresses the relationship between the child and its social and natural environment, and the children learn to interface through observation and practice directly with nature, not like today with the iPads and the iPhones. So governments sometimes don't understand these important family values of indigenous peoples. Now, one important indicator of the severity of how these threats are attempting against indigenous peoples is the native languages. It takes about 6,000 years for a language to be developed from a common root. Yet today, 26 languages of the 7,000 languages in the world disappear or are lost forever every year. This means one language every 14 days. So it is like saying that every year humanity loses 156,000 years of memory and knowledge. So today we know that there's immense value in learning languages, but governments suppress learning native languages. So in summary, the world needs to respect and fully embrace human diversity. And today I would like to encourage you to take a step in that direction. Please learn about indigenous peoples. Support legislation for indigenous people recognition. Dedicate part of your professional, technical, or scientific efforts to discovering the wealth of knowledge of indigenous nations and learn a native language. Recognizing the immense value of cultures will help us build a more peaceful, plentiful, and harmonious planet. Thank you very much.